Pop quiz. What would you do if some messy guy in your town called you over and said he had just come down from heaven and that God had let him know that he was Jesus' younger brother? Oh, and yes, and that God actually wanted you, to follow the man, abandon your home, swear a vow of celibacy, and try to overthrow the government. If you answered to back away very quickly, then you're not thinking like a Chinese person from the South in the 1850s, because that's precisely what millions upon millions of them did. The Taiping Rebellion was one of the most catastrophic man-made disasters of all time. It killed about 25 million people, which is a staggering number. Wikipedia says that that's the second deadliest modern war of all time, greater than World War I and second only to World War II. If you haven't heard about it, that doesn't make you unique. Most textbooks are so confused by this mystery that they just skitter right over it. The New York State textbook, the most popular New York State history textbook, covers it in 3 paragraphs, which, if you're doing the math at home, is about 125,000 deaths per word. And this event, which really did kill off a population larger than Australia, was actually founded by one man, a guy named Hung Shu-Xuan, who preached Christianity in southern China in 1850. And Hung was a Chinese civil servant, or tried to be a Chinese civil servant in the 1800s, but failed the exams 3 separate times, at which point he became an itinerant preacher, fell in with a Protestant missionary from England, and started going into trances where he went to heaven. Today we might call those psychotic breaks, but back then he had lots of interesting visions that he was willing to share and people were willing to follow. In one of them, he met Confucius in heaven, who tried to overthrow God by getting a team of demons to do so, but a team of angels, Confucius, Jesus, and Hung were able to capture him, tie him up, bind him, throw him at the feet of God, and flog him in a scene that is kinky even by today's 50 Shades of Grey standards. So, how and why did anyone up and follow a man who heard voices? The answer has got a lot to do with what was happening in China in the 1850s. And the key to this is that what Hung had to say was something that other people heard and thought, this might help me. First off, China was not ruled by the Chinese. It was ruled in the 1800s by something called the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty was from Manchuria. They were barbarians who had ridden in the 1600s, conquered and forced everyone in southern China to shave their heads and leave a long ponytail called the queue. Ethnic Chinese, Han, hated this queue and wanted to drive the barbarians out. And this man's Hung, his desire to overthrow the standard order and bring a Christian kingdom to the world, Christian kingdom in Chinese, or heavenly peace, was known as Taiping. Hung's desire to form a Taiping rebellion was just the ticket they needed to overthrow the hated Qing dynasty. Now, if you weren't all that into overthrowing the Qing dynasty, you might still hate the Confucian civil servants exams, just like you kids at home hate standardized exams. Talk about hard tests. This one failed 19 out of every 20 people who took it, including Han, and took 10 years of study. So, a Christian kingdom was one where the official books were the New Testament and Old Testament, and lots of would-be educated people heard Han's preaching and said, my God, school might be out forever. Then there were people who were called the Hakka, and the Hakka, though it sounds like a bad sound in your throat, were actually very numerous people who lived together in communal villages and shared all their property and land, living in sort of spaceship-like circular huts. They wanted land, and Han was one of them. And when Han said, Jesus said, blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth, they went, that means that we might get some earth, but God knows we need it. And who cares about being poor, because the Hakka shared everything. Finally, another group of people who listened to Han were actually turned on by celibacy. And those were women. Now, what would make women think celibacy was good? Perhaps this. If you see a picture of a Chinese woman in the 1800s, she might have very small feet. Those were called bird feet, and they fit into bird shoes because they were so tiny. They were called that. But the only way to get your feet into those bird shoes was to do this, to break your toes underneath your foot, or have your mom do it for you, and while you screamed in pain as you grew up, your foot would grow up, not out, and you'd have tiny feet. That was the only way that you got a good marriage in China in the 19th century. And so, when Han preached the heavenly peace, what he meant was, you got to not get married, and you didn't need bound feet. Well, that was a form of women's liberation that women in China could really get behind. In fact, some of them formed their own fighting units and joined the Taiping Rebellion. So, by 1853, 10 million people had joined a rebellion to create a Christian nation in China, killed all the Qing, and had taken over southern China to the point where they controlled the second largest city in the country and 30 million people. And this laid the groundwork for a truly terrifying disaster, which would lead to people throwing themselves off 50-foot-high walls to their deaths. But before we get there, what you have to understand is that you've just learned a very valuable lesson in history. And that lesson is this. You can't understand the disasters of yesterday with the mindset of now. You can't even understand the disasters of history by looking backward at them. What you have to do is get into the minds of people and how they lived. What was important to them. And while it might seem crazy to you, land, the ability to walk uncrippled, the ability not to take terrifying exams, and the ability to get rid of foreigners were so important that even itinerant preacher and crazy man sounded pretty good in China. Think like other people, because history is people. Hello.